Previously in our last episode, we saw Jacob, Israel, dispensing blessings upon his sons. And these blessings, they were reflections of their actions leading up to this juncture in time, with very specific details on them. And these blessings are not necessarily for the immediate, but as a prophecy to the future of a future time to come. And some of it is quite fascinating. After doing these blessings, he passed away. He slept with his fathers, as they say. He was no longer alive. Genesis 50:1. Then Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. 50:2. And Joseph ordered his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. This is a very sad occasion. This man was very well loved by his children, and I'm presuming he had a lot of grandkids at this point as well. So, I mean, he was very well aged and well seasoned in years. And then we have this second portion here on this next line with references to the act of embalming. If a body's not embalmed, they rot really quickly. It doesn't take very long. It doesn't take very long for things to return back to nature. And Egypt is kind of known for their embalming practices, especially in the old world. They had it figured out. So he has these guys embalm his father. So, because he made that promise to him a couple chapters ago, right? That he was going to take him back to bury him with Abraham and Isaac in that Hittite cemetery. So this is just kind of a preserving process so that his body doesn't completely rot, and they still have something to take there to that cemetery for the burial process.
Genesis 50:3. Then 40 days were devoted to this purpose for him, for that is the customary number of days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians wept and bemoaned him as they would for royalty for 70 days. So there we go, 40 days to embalm him. I guess that's just how long the process takes. It takes a while to kind of dry out the corpse and do the chemicals or whatever it is. This was the process of the Egyptians. They didn't have the fancy chemicals that we have today. Now, I don't know if they put all of his organs in jars like you see in some of those Egyptian movies, or if that was something they did at a later period of time, whether or not it was just some sort of chemical solution that they replaced the blood with to prevent the rotting process. But it's hard to say, and it probably doesn't make a big difference either way. And of course, the second portion of this, we have the Egyptians mourning for him as if he was royalty. And I think that's kind of fascinating. We almost think of it like, they get down to Egypt and then he died the next week, right? But in reality, he lived for many years with the Egyptians and probably had some bonds with them and their relationship with Joseph as well, that it's like, oh man, Joseph, he's just such a great guy getting us through this famine, and his dad's not doing so well. And I could understand the sorrow that way. But anyway, he was well liked and well loved for this mourning process. I mean, yeah, I guess you could be the other end of that, where it's like, well, when a royalty dies, we have to mourn for this long, or they get like whipped or something, right? It's like, hey, you better start mourning, you better start wailing, you better start lamenting, and make like a whole ceremony out of it. And it's not like a true thing, but I think this is that he was truly missed when he was gone, not like something that was like, people were wailing because that was like a customary thing to do, that if they didn't do it, that they would get punished, right? Genesis 50:4. And when the days of his weeping and deep grief were past, Joseph said to the nobles of the house of Pharaoh, if now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, to Pharaoh, For Joseph was dressed in mourning and could not do so himself, saying, 50:5, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb, which I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. So now let me go up, I pray you, and bury my father, and I will come again. So for whatever reason, Joseph is not able to go directly to the Pharaoh to ask for permission to go and bury his father in the land of Canaan. There must be some sort of religious or significance or whatever that the Egyptians or whatever, that they can't deal with someone who is wearing the clothes of somebody in mourning. But then again, maybe it's the other aspect is that, you know, he's not feeling up to the task or could make himself presentable to be in front of Pharaoh to ask as well. So he's getting the nobles here to ask on his behalf for permission to go and bury his father like he had promised. You really can't get over someone's death until you have the closure of either like a funeral or some sort of ceremony, or in the case of like somebody dies in kind of a weird circumstance, that you have some sort of mental understanding of the situation, right? Like you don't really rest until the murderer is found or the body is found, so to say, right? So in this instance, right, you know, his father's dead, and they have him embalmed, and he's probably sitting in a cool basement somewhere, right? But until he's really, you know, put in his final resting place, the healing can't really start. You can't really get over it well. You're kind of in that limbo state. So he wants to bury his father, and this will help, you know, all of his brethren as well, and look after one of the final requests that his father made as well, and then he can kind of be separate and be free from that binding. Genesis 50:6. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So the Pharaoh gave permission for him to go and bury his father. They had a really good relationship. And this Pharaoh, I think we have different pharaohs as we go through time, because, you know, they keep dying and we get new pharaohs or whatever. But this Pharaoh in particular seems like a pretty straight up guy and gets along good with Joseph, and seems pretty good that way. Genesis 50:7. And Joseph went up to Canaan to bury his father, and with him went all the officials of Pharaoh, the nobles of his court, and the elders of his house, and all the nobles and elders of the land of Egypt. Not only is he given permission to bury his father in the land of Canaan, but this turns into a huge procession. All these guys, all these nobles, they're coming with him for this burial process. Very ceremonial. Genesis 50:8. And all the household of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and herds they left in the land of Goshen. 50:9. And there went with Joseph both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. This is probably one of the biggest funeral events or whatever that has ever existed in the world at this point in time. Genesis 50:10. And they came to the thrashing floor of Atad, which is beyond the west of Jordan. And there they mourned with a great lamentation and extreme demonstrations of sorrow, according to Egyptian custom. And Joseph made a mourning for his father 7 days. Actually, now that I think about it, Egypt is definitely known for mourning and funeral rites for the dead and all this fun stuff. So it would make sense that if the Egyptians were there, that they would just kind of crank it up to 11 and they would just go to town with their mourning process. I'm sure the wailing was deafeningly loud, like a concert today. Genesis 50:11. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians. Therefore the place was called Abel Mizraim, morning of Egypt. It is west of the Jordan. So this funeral was so over the top and so intense that they named the place after it. That's just wild. If you're going to mourn, you gotta mourn like an Egyptian. Genesis 50:12. Thus Jacob's sons did for him as he had commanded them. 50:13. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of Machpelah, east of Mamre, which Abraham bought among with the field, for a possession as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. Just from casually reading over this, I wonder if they carried him, like physically carried him the entire way. They didn't put the wagon down. They didn't do any of that fun stuff where you transport it by means of locomotion with the animals, that they physically carried him the whole way. And if they did, that would be quite the journey, and it's a good thing he's got so many sons. Genesis 50:14. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brethren and all who had gone up with him. So it sounds like they didn't have any fatalities along the way, like we saw in a previous journey where not everybody made it, but in this instance they all made it. They probably were well supplied. They probably had a caravan with them or whatever that was bringing food and stuff, and was able to look after this large group of people, because this would have been after that great famine, so stuff was probably a little bit easier in this time, but that would have been one long journey with a rather large company, all to bury a man. And they succeeded. Genesis 50:15. When Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps now Joseph will hate us and will pay us back for all the evil we did to him. So there is that idea, we kind of have a little rumbling of the family that Joseph might want to get even. You know, he was sold into slavery. He went on this big adventure, and his brothers there that did this to him. Maybe Joseph will want to get even with him, and they're murmuring about this. I mean, it's understandable. Maybe, Joseph just didn't retaliate because of the love of his own father, and, he was kind of holding them back, so to say. Genesis 50:16. And they sent a messenger to Joseph, saying, your father commanded before he died, saying, 50:17. So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, take up and away all resentment and all claim to requital concerning, I pray you now, the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now we pray you forgive the trespass of the servants of your father's God. And Joseph wept when they spoke this to him. I don't know exactly what's going on here. I can picture several scenarios. One would be that Joseph has already forgiven them for in his journey to Egypt and his time as a slave, that during that process, as well as the setting up the food for the future and being able to deliver his family, knowing that this was God's plan and that his brothers, they threw him into slavery, but this was part of something greater. This was part of the divine plan, and I can't really blame his brothers for that, for the outcome was greater than if he had been there alone the whole time. And I think maybe he was weeping because of that they didn't know that he already forgave them and was just going about his things or whatever, that this was all in the past, and that it kind of hurt them when they thought that he was still in that state. And then the other possibility I could see would be that, he was really kind of bummed out about his brothers doing that to him, and that their father was interceding, and he was just thinking about his father in that intercession. And that made him kind of grievous, that it was like hurting his father by him holding this resentment to his brothers for throwing him into slavery. But I think it's more along the first path, than it is the second. But there is a multitude of scenarios that this could be, right? Genesis 50 and 18. Then his brothers went and fell down before him, saying, "See, we are your servants, your slaves." They are prostrating themselves before Joseph to look for mercy, for what they did was very heinous. Genesis 50 and 19. And Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for I am in the place of God. Vengeance is his, not mine." Genesis 50 and 20. As for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are this day. 50 and 21. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for and support you and your little ones. And he comforted them, imparting cheer, hope, and strength, and spoke to their hearts kindly. I'm sure this was very comforting to hear, to know that Joseph wasn't out for blood, that he didn't desire vengeance, that vengeance belonged to God. And if there was any judgment to be had, it would be on God to perform the act of the judgment or whatever. That Joseph was fine with it. He made peace with this, and he was okay with them. And he says he's going to look after their kids as well as them. So that's just kind of wonderful. Genesis 50 and 22. Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. So he spent the majority of his life in the land of Egypt. Only in his childhood was he in Canaan. Genesis 50 and 23. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, son of Manasseh, were brought up on Joseph's knees. So here we have this beautiful scene of this old man who is still alive but on his way out, sitting with his grandchildren or great-grandchildren or whatever it is, multiple generations of age. Genesis 50 and 24. And Joseph said to his brethren, "I am going to die, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. They need to return to the promised land, and one of the descendants will be able to get them there." Genesis 50 and 25. And Joseph took an oath from the sons of Israel, saying, "God will surely visit you, and will carry up my bones from here." So at first he's uttering the words, but in the second instance he's making a promise, making a pledge. And of course we got this idea of carrying the bones up, so he's going to be long gone at that point in time. He's already dying. And so they need to take his bones up there and bury him in that field of the Hittite or whatever, into the same place that they buried Jacob not too long ago. So the family cemetery, so to say. Genesis 50 and 26. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And here we have the ending of the life of Joseph, the man that was running Egypt and leading Egypt to prosperity. We'll have to see what happens next, and we'll take that up when we start the Exodus.